Okay, so we're stepping into our first official week. The first week that we had was more of an introductory week where we're looking at the expectations for the course, and you were introducing yourself as far as who you are as a student and everything of that nature. This will be the first week of curriculum that we have. So this is Module 1, Week 1. Module 1 is a two-part module. The first portion here, we're going to get a foundational understanding of what theory is. And then next week we'll look at some specific theories so that you can kind of take the concepts we learned this week and apply them to those actual theories. Now, I start the semester off by looking at communication theory for two reasons. One, it's very foundational to understand what communication theory is. So, for example, communication theory allows us, from simplest to most complicated, it allows us to do four things. It allows us to describe what's happening in a communication-based phenomenon. It allows us to explain what's happening. It also allows us to predict what could happen. And it allows us to control communication behavior as well. So again, from simplest to most complicated, describe, explain, predict, and control are the aspects that communication theory allow us to use whenever we're looking at a communication-based phenomenon. Now, more importantly, probably for you in this class, though, is you will be expected for your final project, which is due at the end of the semester, to unpack communication theory, to select a couple of communication theories that describe a particular communication-based problem that you see in the healthcare industry, and you'll unpack specific theories and use them to help you describe, explain, predict, and control that particular problem, and that allows you to come up with a solution. We'll look more at the final project starting next week, but for now, be keeping that in the back of your mind, that communication theory is going to allow us to do those four things, and that you'll be expected to use communication theory to help describe, explain, predict, and control a particular problem that is communication based in the healthcare industry. Say, for example, the way that interactions between a doctor and a nurse may lead to miscommunication. Why is that? Explaining the communication patterns between a healthcare provider and the patient, or the administration and a patient, nurse to nurse, whatever the case may be. You'll be selecting one of those communication interactions that is problematic, and you'll be using theory to help describe, explain, predict, and control. And so we'll look at this as we go along further, but that's really why I like to start off early on, so you have these understandings moving forward. And that's really the goal of the course as a whole, is to build upon itself and ultimately culminate in the final project, as it were. So let's go ahead and jump into this right away. What is a theory? Well, scholars would suggest that a communication theory, really, as it says here, is just a description of how something works. So when we're looking at a communication interaction, when we're looking at communication behavior, theory is a way of describing how that interaction is taking place. What is happening, what behaviors are being exhibited, things of that nature. It just really, think of it as allowing us, as it says, to make sense of communication behavior. Communication between humans is very hard to understand. It's very hard to really study, and communication theory gives us parameters that we can look at it and be able to observe it in an empirical way. They also suggest that it provides an explanation for what's going on. Now, this is next level, right? Now, instead of just describing what's happening, which pretty much anyone can describe what is taking place, communication theory allows us to explain why it's taking place. So it brings in that kind of cause and effect aspect to looking at communication behavior. It takes observations that we have, and it applies empirical research to it, so that way we can form more kind of tried and true ways of understanding the way that humans interact with each other in certain communication behaviors. Now, because this is providing such an understanding that can be applied to different situations, as you would imagine, there's definitely certain rules that communication theory has to follow whenever it's being formed. We don't just make these up based off a couple of cases. We don't just make up what we think is happening. There are certain rules that take place when we're developing communication theories that make sure that it's as rigid and empirical as possible. So one of the first rules is that theories have to be based in something that exists in reality. An example that I like to give about this, you see here Richard Kirwan's 1787 theory of phlogiston. Kirwan was interested in trying to provide a theoretical understanding of how fire worked. And as we know, there is I don't know what you heard about it in grade school, but for me it was called the fire triangle, right? There were three aspects to what makes a fire a fire. The first is heat. The second is fuel, like some kind of fuel, whether it's gasoline, whether it's wood, whatever the case may be, some kind of fuel. And the third aspect to it is oxygen, right? It needs oxygen to survive. Now, Kirwan was doing this research in the late 1700s and was trying to figure out what it was that made fire go. Now, he knew fuel was definitely one, and he knew heat was another. He just didn't know what the third was. And he was not able to determine that it was oxygen. So what he said was it was phlogiston. He didn't really have an actual thing. He called it phlogiston. There was no actual scientific backing to it. It was just something that he created. So phlogiston did not exist in reality. It was not the third piece to the triangle. It wasn't until later that Joseph Priestley found out that it was actually oxygen. And that's whenever we've got that existence in reality, right? So instead of phlogiston, this made up kind of thing that he wasn't sure, was just filling in a blank, oxygen is determined to be that third thing. So theory has to have components to it, and it has to be based on a phenomenon that exists in reality in order for it to be a theory. Theories also need to be testable. We need to be able, through empirical research, to prove or disprove a theory. So it has to be based on reality and things that we can actually lock onto and test. And I have here, when it comes to psychology, the concept of repression, some people would say comes in a violation to this rule, because repression itself is getting rid of something, right? If I'm repressing memories, I'm actually getting rid of those memories. And the problem with that is you can't test something that doesn't exist. So people would say that the concept of repression is not really testable because repression itself does not exist. So that's kind of that gray area. You know, we developed scales over time and observation techniques that kind of help us to overcome this. But a lot of people would say that repression is not testable because it does not really exist, and therefore we cannot prove or disprove it as a theory. Theories also need to be logically consistent. They need to match up with other theories that are measuring similar phenomenon, but they need to also be consistent within themselves. So we cannot have, for example, like I have here, let's say there's a media theory, a theory about media that says that the persuasive tactics of a particular media are very important. And we can't say within that theory that strong tactics work very well and weak tactics work very well. It has to be one or the other, right? We can't be logically inconsistent within our own theory. It all has to line up and be consistent. So how do we develop theories, right? We know the rules of them now. Well, how do people go about developing theories in the communication research world? There's two main schools of thought when it comes to the development of theory, two research paradigms, if you will. The first one is deductive reasoning, right? This is probably the most common, particularly in the hard sciences. Deductive reasoning, we call it quantitative or theory-driven research. What this does is it takes existing literature, existing studies that have been done and have been published in peer-reviewed journals, things of that nature, and it takes them and develops a theoretical framework based on all of that existing literature, and then takes that theoretical framework and directly applies it to the research that it's doing. So it takes existing theory and uses that existing theory to inform its interpretations of communication behavior. This is the most empirical, most scientific and objective way that we can look at communication phenomenon. There is a problem though, and the problem is deductive reasoning, right? When we apply deductive reasoning and our logic is flawed in some way as we build from one thing to the next, we fall victim to faulty logic, faulty reasoning. And I have a little clip here, which I definitely recommend that you look at this clip. It's actually from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's a particular scene from there where you see the problem with deductive reasoning, and it's just a few minutes long. It's definitely entertaining and worth the watch. So, if you want to click on this this URL here and check that out, it's definitely worth your while. But it's the idea that when we're using deductive reasoning and we're saying this exists, so therefore this exists, so therefore this exists, sometimes that runs us into a little bit of trouble. Inductive reasoning is the second main paradigm. Now with inductive, this is qualitative, or we call it grounded research. What we do here is we take direct observations of communication-based phenomenon, and through looking at commonalities and looking at patterns that emerge when looking at these types of phenomena enough, we're able to come to conclusions, and from that we create theory. So it's the opposite, right? With deductive, we're taking existing theory and we're applying that to what it is that we're researching. With the inductive, we're taking what it is that we're researching and we're using that to create existing theory. Now, this is a much more subjective way of going about it, right? This is much more pliable. It's much more up for interpretation whenever we're doing this. Another problem with it, it often relies on very small sample sizes, and it's not generalizable. So when we do inductive research, we're not trying to generalize to a larger population like we are with deductive or quantitative research. With this type of research, we're keeping it based on what we're looking at and developing theory from there. So they're mirror opposites of each other, right? It's you could think of inductive reasoning as more reverse engineering as opposed to deductive reasoning following more of an existing blueprint. So we do have those two very old school kind of ways of looking at things that are very polar opposites of one another. And usually there's a lot of contested debate between quantitative versus qualitative scholars. Over the past decade, there's been a stronger movement towards a third type of gathering research. We call this the abductive approach. And the idea with this is that it's taking the best of both worlds theoretically. That's what we're trying to do, is take the best of both worlds and eliminate the problems that both have. This was put forth by Levine in 2011, and really the idea is a bit further back than that. We would call it a mixed methods approach before it was called an abductive approach. What we're doing here, and Levine would argue that it's more a combination of the two as opposed to a compromise between, but it's a combination of the two approaches. So we're not relying solely on the existing literature and using that as a theoretical framework that we look at all of our information and all of our observations through. But at the same time, we're not ignoring the fact that there is existing literature and there can be a framework that we can use. So deductive and inductive are kind of coming together to form hopefully a more holistic approach that's less flawed. What we do ultimately is, based on the existing literature, we propose several educated guesses, right? Several explanations as to what we think is the best way of looking at a particular phenomenon. Then we go ahead and select what is best and look at that phenomenon through those lenses. Another good thing with the abductive approach is it streamlines your theoretical framework. What it does is we compare similar theories, and as opposed to having a very broad theoretical framework that incorporates a lot of different theories, what it does is it streamlines it and says, these we think are the best theories for this particular research that we're looking at, and then we make that kind of educated guess as to which ones would be best and then use those as our theoretical framework. So it allows us to hopefully get after the best of both worlds. So let's put it together. Deductive approach, we're taking the existing literature and empirically and objectively looking at a phenomenon. Supporters love it because of its objectivity, because of its reliability, because of its consistency. Critics feel that it can be faulty. Deductive reasoning sometimes can get in the way, and it can kind of cloud results and lead to results that seem to be reliable on the surface, but actually are not valid. Inductive approach, it's the opposite, right? We're looking closely at a particular phenomenon in a particular group of people, and we are taking our results and finding commonalities, finding patterns, and using that to create theory. Supporters of this, they think that it's a very good way to expand knowledge as opposed to relying on what they would consider antiquated kind of ways of looking at things. And at the same time, it also provides a voice to marginalized groups, right? So people that wouldn't normally have been in research before, now we're giving them a chance to provide us with their understandings, and it provides a more diverse understanding of communication phenomenon. Critics for this think it's a little too subjective, think that it's not generalizable, so it's not really good for scientific research, and the sample sizes are just too small. The abductive approach, again, educated guesses that we're using to try to understand specific behaviors. Supporters call it a best of both worlds. Critics would say it's a jack of all trades, master of none, that just because it's not taking on all the aspects of it doesn't mean it necessarily picked all the best aspects of it. What I would ask for you to consider is, which one of these do you think you would use? If you were a communication researcher, would you want to take a deductive approach that was taking existing theory and was very objective? Would you want to take an inductive approach, kind of learn based on what you observe as opposed to letting theory guide you? Or would you take the abductive, where you take a little bit of both and you try to figure things out that way? Think about that as you're going through this. All right, so now that we look at the different rules and we look at the different schools of thought, the different paradigms, let's look at what we use theories for. The first, and I gave a tease of this earlier on when we were talking, there's 4 different aspects of what we use theory for. And again, we're going to go from the simplest to the most complex. The simplest is to describe, right? It's just basically telling us what we see when a communication phenomenon is taking place. As it says here, it's answering the question, what is going on during a particular communication-based event? We are just describing what's happening, right? And that's the simplest use of a theory, is to describe what is happening. The key with description and explanation is that we're taking different concepts that exist within a phenomenon or exist within a behavior, right? So you can imagine whenever 2 people are talking with one another, there are all kinds of things that are going on behind the scenes, right? There are all kinds of intrapersonal interaction that's happening within someone's mind, the psychological aspects. There's the interpersonal, what's actually being said, the verbal and nonverbal cues that are taking place. So there's all these different concepts that are happening kind of behind the scenes that we don't necessarily see in a communication-based phenomenon, but they're definitely happening and existing. What we do with concepts and how they're linked to a theory is that concepts, as it says here, if theory is a wall, concepts are the bricks that make up that wall, right? So ultimately, when I come up with a theory that's going to look at a particular communication behavior, it's all of those little behind the scenes things that are happening, those different concepts that are happening, that ultimately lead to the creation of that theory. So what it allows us to do is take those intangible aspects of what's happening, those behind the scenes things, the attitudes, the beliefs, the psychological aspects of humans, and it allows us to bring some kind of tangibility to them, to kind of conceptualize what's happening. With the research classes that I teach, I tell my students what we're doing here is we're taking an abstract concept, right, something that's intangible, and we're creating what's called a concrete construct. So we're going from taking something that's intangible and doing our best through the development of theory and looking at all those concepts to turn it into something more tangible that can be measured. And that's the challenge of communication research, is really how do we take something immeasurable and make it measurable. And if you think about all the different surveys that are out there that are trying to measure someone's attitude towards a product, or someone's belief about a particular thing, or what is your attitude towards the modern political spectrum, all these different things, that's really what they're doing, is they have conceptualized a particular attitude, and they have created this scale or this survey that's a series of questions, a deliberate set of questions that they think best measure that particular concept, right? So that's what theory allows us to do through description. Now, theories also allow us to explain a particular phenomenon, and this is more in-depth than just a simple description, right? This is answering the question, how does a particular communication-based thing happen, right? So when this particular thing is happening, let's explain why it's happening. Now, again, we're getting more into the cause and effect aspect. We say these particular concepts were in place, so it led to this particular communication behavior. Much like describing, explaining a phenomenon, scholars provide a common conceptualization of it that will allow future research to be conducted. So it's really developing that kind of tangible base that other researchers can work off of, but also providing solid answers to questions that allow people, whether it's laypersons or researchers, to understand what's happening. All right, it's explaining not just what is happening, but why it's happening. And this is a key thing to understand, is that most scientists believe that explaining a phenomenon is the most important aspect of theory building. And the reason why is you can't predict and you can't control without explaining. You need to explain why something happened. Just simply describing what is happening is not enough. We need to know why it's happening so that we can use that cause and effect relationship to in turn predict that behavior happening in the future and even controlling that behavior when it does happen, right? So it's very important that you understand that we need to have that explanation. It is critical for us to be able to explain a phenomenon if we are going to control, predict, or I should say predict and control that phenomenon. So let's get on to the prediction, right? Prediction allows us to say, okay, what's next? Or if this thing happens, what result can we expect, right? There is, for example, the expectation violation theory says that whenever we go into every interaction with another human being, there are a series of expectations that we have in our heads of how that interaction should go. And when the interaction does not go the way that we think it should, we have a violation of our expectations and we react in a certain way, right? We will either react positively or negatively depending on how we view the other person, depending on how we view the situation, etc. Right? So this is the expectation violation theory is a prediction theory. It's saying if this happens, then we expect to see this happen. Researchers take the explanations supplied by past and present research and apply it to the future. I have this example here, which is less about behavior and more about prediction. Colleges often, for their entrance applications, they use this algorithm. They'll use regression analysis, statistical analysis, and they'll take things like a student's cumulative GPA in high school, their ACT, SAT scores, maybe their cumulative GPA in different STEM classes that they took, and they'll take that algorithm or that regression and they'll crunch the numbers, and based on those numbers they can predict what a student's first year college GPA will be. And if that number is below their threshold of acceptance, they don't accept the student, but if it's at or above whatever their threshold is, they will accept the student. So what they're doing is they're taking previous behavior, what their grades and test scores were in the past, and they're using that to predict what they think future behavior will be. And that's what we do with communication theory a lot. We use it to predict what we think behavior will be in a particular situation. All right, we can also make predictions about how a person will react to another person's behavior, like I said, with the expectation violation theory and things of that nature. Describing, explaining, predicting all lead us up to the final piece of the puzzle, which is control. And for your discussion thread this week, I'm asking you to look at this concept of control. Now, here in this slide, I'll talk about how it's not really a negative thing, right? Usually when we hear the word control, it has a negative connotation to it. And this slide will say, well, really, it's not a negative thing. It's really more about kind of facilitating what happens and making improvements, things of that nature. But I want you to consider that for your discussion this week. How can control, when it comes to communication, a knowledge of people and how they interact, using that to control other people, how can that be negative and how could that be positive? I want you to kind of consider that. Again, for the purposes of this slide, we're not going to look at it in a negative fashion. We're really saying, how should I act if I want a certain result? what factors can be used to change a behavior or phenomenon, things of that nature, right? And we use this in day-to-day life. We really do. Imagine if you're getting into an argument with your significant other and you're trying to defuse the situation. Well, a knowledge of communication behavior and a knowledge of theoretical concepts associated with it would certainly come in handy. If you could say, you know, if I do this particular thing, they will then in turn react in this particular way, right? It's something that we do in day-to-day life. Communication researchers use theory to help us understand and control behavior in that way. It's not about mind control. It's really just more about getting a desirable result from an undesirable situation, basically, is what it comes down to. As it says here, the second thing is really important to you. When we create an action plan to solve an organizational communication problem, we're using the control aspect of theory. And that's what you're going to be doing for your final project, right? You're going to say, here's a communication-based phenomenon that exists in the healthcare industry. Based on my understanding of it through theoretical concepts, here's what I think is happening, why it's happening, how I can predict it happening in the future, and how I can help control it. And here is a plan that I have in place based on this theory that is going to allow me to effectively change the way that this is happening. And you're going to create an action plan, and you're going to provide us with a video tutorial and all this kind of stuff, which we'll start talking about more next week. But that's an example that you'll be using this semester of how to control behavior, is this action plan that you'll come up with that's based on communication theory. All right, so theorists use the concepts and findings of theories to provide advice and suggest how we should act if we want certain results, right? So if we want people to act in a certain way, then there's certain ways that we can act to make that happen based on theory. All right, so it describes, it says what is happening in a situation, it explains why and how it's happening, it predicts what will happen if this happens, what can we expect, and it controls. How can a situation be handled to get a desired result that we have? Okay, so we're going to move on to the practical functions of theory now. There's 3 different ways that we use theory. The first way is to use it as a net. Think of this as like a fisherman's net, right? We're casting out this net, trying to drag in as many fish as we can. The fish is all the different communication phenomenon. It's all the different interactions and behaviors that are out there. And theory hopefully can be used as that net to catch as many fish as possible. The thing with a net, all right, there's the meshing that's in the net, and there's those little holes that are in between in the mesh there. Sometimes fish slip through, and sometimes we catch big fish, right? So theory is that same kind of way. There's sometimes that a particular theory just does not really accurately explain certain phenomenon, and other times that it does. It can be used as a lens, right? Just like your glasses, whenever you put them on, for those of us that wear glasses, myself, I'm nearsighted, so things that are further away are very fuzzy to me. When I put on my glasses, they become much more clear. Theory works the same way, right? Whenever there's all these different communication behaviors and communication phenomenon that are taking place, theory allows us to bring them more clearly into focus. Last way is it's a map. It provides us with a lay of the land, right? Future research is done. We build off of that research, and by the time it gets to us, we have a very good foundational understanding of what to expect. We use that theoretical framework to help us understand it in a new way. We call that heuristic research, right? Building off of previous research. The example that I give a lot is, way back in the day, Lewis and Clark, they were moving west across the American continent. And they were mapping things as they go until they got all the way to the Pacific, along with the help of Sacagawea. They were doing all that mapping as they went, and the map that they created helped the next generation of explorers to move across, and they built a map off of their map, and maps were refined and became better and better over time, and eventually we have a very descriptive and very accurate map of the United States that allows us to understand what is happening and what's going on. And that's what theory can do as well. All right, so we'll look at, I believe, what is the last portion of this, this lecture, what makes a good theory, right? We talked about the rules, we talked about the uses, we talked about all that different stuff. What makes a good theory? The first thing is that a theory needs to be simple. We want to take the concept of Occam's razor, right? The idea that the simplest answer is usually the best answer. We try to keep theory as simple as possible. There are some theories out there that have, over 100 axioms, and they're very thorough and very complex, and a lot of times they're very difficult to use. We like to keep them simple so that we can build on them, right? And the simpler something is, the more we can build upon it. It should be consistent with related theories. I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about some of the rules of communication, that it needs to be consistent within itself. It also needs to be consistent with other theories. So if I've got a theory that's looking at why people react to certain behaviors in communication, and it needs to be similar to other theories that are looking at similar behaviors and similar interactions, right? So it should be very simple. And I have here the exception to this is during times of scientific revolution, whenever we're deciding that the way that things are understood is not right and we're trying to look at things differently. This really applies more to astronomy and things of that nature than it does to communication, but it does happen. All right, the last two theories should be interpretable. Meaning we should be able to use it to reliably do all the things that theory does. In this case, I have a media-based phenomenon, but really a communication-based phenomenon. It should be something that we can actually look at and apply to it with no fail, right? So that particular communication-based phenomenon, we need to be able to interpret it through the lens of that theory, and it should be reliable. And the last thing, it should be useful. Other researchers and as I have here, lay people should be able to take this theory to be able to apply it to everyday life, so that awkward conversation you have where you're talking with someone and maybe they're standing a little too close to you, right? Expectancy violation, right? Someone's standing a little close to you. Why is it that you react the way you do when someone stands too close? When someone holds eye contact for so long, why do you act the way you do? Well, expectancy violation theory would certainly provide us with a useful explanation as to why that is. All right, so big fat slide here, but really what I'm getting at is that what I want you to start doing right now is thinking about communication-based problems in the healthcare industry. So again, the miscommunication that we see, let's say, for example, a patient is being discharged from the hospital. Oftentimes we have a huge disconnect or a lot of miscommunication that takes place between the nurse that's discharging the patient and the patient, right? Whether it's because the patient is not listening properly because they're nervous or they're excited to get out or whatever the case may be, or maybe the nurse is kind of just going through the motions because they do the same discharge order day in and day out and they don't really place enough emphasis on particular things. Whatever the case may be, that is a communication-based problem. The way that doctors communicate with nurses, communication-based problem, we see that a lot. Is that because the doctor is talking down to the nurse? Is that because the doctor is in too big of a hurry? Is that because the nurse isn't actively listening? What is happening there? What's going on? So think of a communication-based problem that you see in the healthcare industry, and then I want you to think of how you would describe, explain, predict, and control that particular instance that's happening. So describe it. How do you describe that phenomenon that's happening? How do you explain it? Why do you think that it's taking place? Predict. What do you think needs to be in place for that particular behavior to happen? And how do you control it, right? That's going to be important as well, because ultimately you're going to come up with that action plan based on how you think you can control it later in the semester. So that's it for this week's lecture. Basically, I want you to be thinking about that. Next week, we're going to look at some specific theories that you can start using to apply that will describe, explain, control, and predict and control different communication-based problems that we see. At that point, you'll start honing more in on them and deciding which ones you want to use for your final projects. So be thinking about that, communication-based problems in the healthcare industry. If you get any questions, obviously feel free to let me know. Email me, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. Other than that, that's it for this lecture, and I appreciate you listening, and enjoy your week.